Ákos, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Just a few words in Hungarian for those who are here coming from Budapest and sitting also in the audience. So mindenkit szeretettel üdvözlök, és az előadást angolul fogom majd tartani annak érdekében, hogy azt hiszem, hogy ez a közös nyelv, akit valószínűleg az egész hallgatóság megért. So I'm switching back to English, and I would like to welcome you all. I'm really happy that you came in this hot afternoon in Oradea, and I would like to thank Orsolya Borsodi Nagy and Deodat Zug for inviting me to be part of this very renowned series of lecture, Darvas Talks, and also part of the celebration of Art Nouveau architecture, which has the title The Colors of Art Nouveau. And indeed, I understand this not only as, you know, as the colors that you kind of immediately see when you enter this building, but also the different shades and different kind of expressions, the different languages that Art Nouveau architecture speaks. And I will start this lecture, which has this title, Between Körösf6 and Vienna, Divergences and Convergences in Hungarian Art Nouveau Architecture, because seemingly, you know, they are very controversial positions here. Vienna, on one hand, which is more a kind of a geometric style, at least, you know, if you think of the Secession building in Vienna, and on the other hand, the different variations of Hungarian Nouveau that itself, you know, had its own types and typologies. So I will start this lecture contrasting two seemingly opposite positions in the architecture around 1900. The one is represented by the Viennese architect Otto Wagner, and the other, Ödön Lechner, who is called very often the father figure of Hungarian Art Nouveau architecture. Indeed, both played this role very much. You know, they were establishing their own followers' schools. In the case of Otto Wagner, it was really a school because he was professor of a very famous master school, not at the Technical University, but at the Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna. And Ödön Lechner, who always aimed, and also his supporters wanted him, you know, to establish a formal master school like the Viennese master, but for various reasons, and I'm not going to go into details, it never happened. It has its, you know, the figures who didn't think that Lechner style should be one that is taught on a school level. But he had many followers, and indeed, even if not in a formal sense, you can speak of a Lechner schools because of the architects who worked along the lines of Lechner's architecture. So they belong to the same generations of architects, and also Wagner was born 1841, you see, and then Lechner was 4 years longer. But I think, and I will show in my lecture, that these two positions didn't exclude each other. And to prove this, I will also follow the tracks of two important Hungarian architects from the younger generation. The one is József Vágó, who is one of the designers of this house where we are, and the other is István Medgyaszay. He was born as István Benko, but he changed later his name to Medgyaszay. It was his mother's name. And they were born exactly in the same year. So they were both from the same generations, and Medgyaszay was exactly 4 months older than Vágó. I chose these two architects because they both received creative impulses as well from the Viennese architecture of Otto Wagner and his circle, as from the Hungarian efforts to create a national style. And this allows me a kind of a critical reassessment of my initial assumption regarding the Wagner versus Lechner opposition, internationalism on one hand, national style on the other. To show you, why these two tendencies were considered oppositions, I start with two examples. The one is a work of Ödön Lechner on the left-hand side, the other of Otto Wagner of Vienna. And I chose these two examples because they are exactly the same building in terms of function and in terms of client, the post office savings banks. It was a new institution at the turn of the century because, as you know, the banking earlier was an issue that was dealt by the big private banks, the Rothschilds and so on, many financial institutes, but these were institutes for the rich. And the so-called simple people, middle class, the workers and so on, for them they established first in England this new institution, the Post Office Savings Bank. It was the network of the post offices that were worked, as they transferred money from one to another post office in the different cities, and they had different financial means, guaranteed the investment. Social considerations were very important from the very beginning, exemption from taxes and duties and deposits. They also started with the children, this kind of savings booklets that probably you are familiar from your childhood and don't know whether they still exist. But anyway, the idea of saving had to be popularized among the members of the society, and therefore both buildings were not just to fulfill the function of a savings bank with a central cashier's hall and the different offices, but they also had to, represent this idea of saving. And I will show you later, even in details, how this principle of saving developed a specific iconography. And how, of course, and that's the main issue here, how both Lechner on one hand and Wagner on the other interpreted this iconography of saving differently. Here you see the ground plans of the two post office savings banks. Interestingly, they both were built on lands that were formerly occupied by military buildings. In Budapest, it was the új épület, this hated Habsburg military barracks, a place of executions and so on, that was destroyed. And they started to develop this for important government building, but also for financial institutions. And in the case of Otto Wagner's Vienna, it was the Vienna Ringstraße, and again a large military barracks occupied this site that was also pulled down at this time. And this is the first stage. And then there was also a second period when Otto Wagner, some 10 years later, built a second building behind this one. But that doesn't interest us at the very moment. You see the typology. They both have lateral wings with offices, and the main hall, the main contact, the cashier's hall was in the courtyard with a skylight. So it was a sky-lit big hall, and in the perimeter you had the different cashier's desks. Probably this comparison of the two facades allow us to make some first assessments regarding the appearance of the building in an urban context. As you have seen, both have this kind of projecting central part. And what is already clear when you see these pictures, Lechner's building is, it moves from the ground where you have this plinth. And on this plinth, these vertical elements are growing up, and the attic is a kind of a dynamic, waving movement. In the case of Otto Wagner, it's the opposite. It also had a very significant a central facade clad. Löchner's facade is clad on one hand with kind of ceramic bricks and an infill that is ornamented. The parapets are kind of richly ornamented, and then of course the line of the attic has these Zsolnai pyrogranite elements that I can show you later in detail. In the case of Otto Wagner, it also has a plinth which is clad with granite slabs of about 10 centimeters, and the upper part is a very fine cladding of just 2 centimeter thin pieces of marble from Sterzing. And in contrast to Lechner's building, it has a very strong kind of cornice, and the uppermost part is decorated with all these kind of winged figures, and of course the imperial city Vienna also requires this kind of wreaths that are hanging from an aluminum clad kind of console. You see here a photograph of the Lechner building, how different it is. You know, the symbolism is very much coming from a kind of imagined Hungarian architecture, tent as a motive. As you know, for Lechner, one basic inspiration was textile. The embroideries, he studied this, and he studied quite a lot of collections of ornaments of Oriental art. So obviously I don't think that I need to emphasize this, because it is quite well known that for Lechner the origins of Hungarian art and architecture comes from the Orient, from ancient Persia, and therefore he had a collection of ornamental drawings that he could use. And of course a kind of a mediator between those sources and Lechner's own architecture was a certain József Huszka, who started to publish a number of books on the Hungarian and Székely ornaments. This, I'm just come back for a moment, this kind of borders that are also, that familiar from textile art, are a particular motif that also appears in 19th century industrial architecture, even in factory building. But for Lechner, who used this as a much more fanciful way, more colorfully, and also kind of filling the blank areas in the border. It was new, and he needed this kind of ornamental studies in order to make it. The ceramic elements that were cast and produced in the Zsolnai factory are also, hints to kind of gold finds as treasure. Again, the function of the bank had to do with treasures, and for Lechner, the treasure of Nagy Miklós that was discovered some time before was a direct model for making these bull heads, for instance. To use a colorful ceramic cladding for Lechner was not just an issue of color, but the colorful city was also something that differed from the gray buildings of the big metropolises, first of all, of the big industrial city in Western Europe. Also, the reason for using marble in the case of Otto Wagner was also similar. He himself emphasized even that the eternal shine of the facade is something that he aimed at. In both cases, hygiene was an important requirement, as the harmful effect of polluted air in the big city were being highlighted by several physicians, doctors at the turn of the century. Lechner thought, for instance, and I quote, "The dusty, smoky air of modern cities, packed into the pores of the facades of houses, makes them dirty and the whole city gloomy, while a washable, dusty substance keeps the houses hygienic and in their original pleasant colors." The color itself was also in favor of the ceramics, as was the thinness of the tiles, which is also a factor to be taken into account in the price of land in a large city and in the economy of modern construction. So again, Otto Wagner argued, as we will see, very significantly. And the followers of Lechner, they were using certain motives. On one hand, this issue of the attic, the waving lines, floral ornaments that you will find in many big cities, in Subotica, in Szabadka, in Marosvásárhely, in Tirgumures, and of course also here. Now, what is, in Wagner's case, what is the iconography of cladding? On one hand, it is certainly difficult to point out, the exact oppositions here, but for Otto Wagner, saving was first of all to minimize the use of expensive materials. So he said that earlier, to build a stone-clad facade, it was necessary to build heavy scaffoldings because the stone slabs were so heavy. But now, in our modern age, you can really slice stone very thin, and then you can clad the facade with these kind of very precise tiles of marble. But of course, in this case, the facade is a cladding, and to represent that it is not a heavy facade, he used this kind of very interesting motif of the bolts. These were bolts made of bronze, but they had a cap of aluminium. So Otto Wagner was one of the first architects who used aluminium in architecture. Many details on this image, for instance. These are all made of aluminium. Otherwise, aluminium was used for grills, elevators, and so on, but not on the facade of buildings. In Vienna, you even have an office building where the entire facade is made of aluminium. So for Wagner, these modern materials were very important. Aluminium was also a non-rusting metal, eternal shine, like in the case of the marble. These were principles that he considered very important. So, and by the hand, I also think that this kind of very strange and new effect. Earlier, well, there are some historians who think that Otto Wagner saw in Spain, in Salamanca, for instance, this kind of small motifs, for instance, shells and so on the facade. The Casa de las Conchas in Salamanca is something like that. But in this case, of course, it's this more kind of machine aesthetics. The rivets, the metal rivets is like, the result of a machine that makes this kind of precise work and this kind of staccato of the machine. I think you can perceive it when you look at this facade. So this would be something that certainly distinguishes this building. You see here also all these elements that on one hand you can compare with motifs of classical architecture, the Gutte and so on, but of course these are all transformed into a new kind of machine aesthetics. And everything that is not kind of structurally necessary is also indicated as such. For instance, a wreath like this is not integrated in the facade, but it is hanging. And for Otto Wagner, all details are very thoughtfully modeled, that you see, that it is something secondary. In principle, you could take them off. You can remove them without, changing essentially the facade. So these are just a few motifs here and there, a wreath, a genius figure, and so on, and that's enough, to celebrate the imperial city. And of course, all these elements I didn't mention, for instance, this kind of glass, colorful glass plates, that all kind of contribute to the effect. In the case of Lechner, again, if you look carefully, you realize that the issue of saving, for Otto Wagner, it was saving work, it was saving building materials. In the case of Lechner, saving means something that exists already in nature. That the bees that are collecting, that are saving, and here they are all kind of going up to a beehive, which is crowning at the end of this kind of chimney pillars. So saving is something that already exists in nature. Saving is not necessarily capitalist economy, but thrift, that exists even in the animal world. I think probably this comparison is sufficient. Let's have a look at some interiors, because these are still quite important. The program that I already outlined, looking at the facades, are kind of consistently developed also in the interior. For Otto Wagner, comfort was very important, meaning also a stair with very long, flat elements. I think it was Auguste Perret, probably, who spoke about the step Marie Antoinette, a kind of a very female-like ascent into the main cashier's hall. On one hand, again, you see here the cladding and pieces of marble. Again, the metal bolts that are fixing it, of course, the bust of the emperor. And again, the aluminum elements that bring into play a kind of a new aesthetics of the modern metropolis of the 20th century. That's the famous cashier's hall or service hall of the Post Office Savings Bank in Vienna. Skylit, as I mentioned, because it's in the courtyard. Again, kind of aluminum-clad pillars, and also in a way that you see that they are not supporting. This is a hanging construction, like a light membrane. So all these elements are slashing through the glass facades. You even see finally the continuation, above the glass. So you really sense it immediately that these are not supporting elements. They are holding the roof structure, which is on top. Again, this kind of lightness is a continuation of the program that you see outside. I should mention again the detailing. For instance, these are the shafts of the ventilation, also air heating, which are kind of standing here like big idols, strange kind of mechanical idols of the industrial age, with this very, very interesting and very physiognomically present elements. But you can look at all these small details, how he generally frames the flat elements to make them again like a panel that is fitted into place and not a kind of a tectonic element. And in the case of Lechner, I don't want to repeat myself. You see here a very dense situation with the tent, with the treasure from the excavation, the bees and so on. Again, a very different kind of program that has nothing to do with the machine aesthetics of the metropolis, like in the case of Wagner in Vienna. A staircase, also for Lechner, he also develops his program further. The waving lines of the attic, this is the wave that kind of continues the movement of the body on the stairwell. And this kind of very interesting capitals, part flower, part bird. So for both architects, it was very important, of course. It's not just an appliqué, but it is a program that defines everything, the space, the interior space, the elevators that, again, are a moving kind of machinic part of the building, but it is, expressed very differently than in the case of Vienna. The main cashier's hall, it doesn't have the light, also skylit, but it doesn't have the skylit light effect of the Viennese hall, but it rather have this, again, the issue of the hexagon, which is certainly, again, the program with the bees, the honeycomb. And probably even, this is the essence, the main result of the thrift of the bees, which is honey, a kind of a golden material that is shining also on the facades of the Lechner building. Now, this was the comparison. Again, both architects had an effect on the architecture of their time. Otto Wagner wrote a very important text for his students, but it was published also for a wide audience. It became very early translated into English, Czech, and so on. Modern Architecture was the title of the first 3 editions. And then it was Hermann Muthesius from Germany who criticized it. He said that modern architecture is not a good title because the new architecture is not a style. A new architecture is without style, it is the truthful expression of our epoch. And that was then the title of the new edition, Die Baukunst unserer Zeit, the building art of our time. It is a kind of like the modern architecture, that modern architecture was, at least in the heroic time, not understood as a new style, but it's a kind of a styleless expression of an era. Otto Wagner was very much present in Hungary. On one hand, he designed, in the competition for the parliament building on the Danube, he designed this project. That was, of course, for the Hungarian jury, 2 Viennese, and it was immediately rejected. It had no chance, of course. But their architect, it was basically an architectural journal of the Otto Wagner circle. But not only Austrian architect. For instance, the Gendarmerie-Schule here in Oradea was also published in detail in this journal. So the whole basic, not even only, but new Budapest buildings, new buildings from the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, they were all published in this newspaper. It was very influential and important. Also, students of Otto Wagner were the designers who made the graphic layout for the publication. And as I mentioned, Otto Wagner had a school, the Wagner Schule, with students from all around the world, even from South America and so on. Not too many Hungarian students studied there. I think altogether 7, and some of them were from German families who lived at that time on the area of the Hungarian kingdom. Medgyaszay, whom I mentioned and who I will speak about, was probably the most notable one of those. But anyway, they also started the work of the students, and you see how certain typical forms, for a corner, for instance, it's Otto Wagner's apartment house, a famous apartment house, the Linke Windseile, in the center of Vienna, and his young co-worker, Josef Maria Olbrich, for a cafe in Opava, in the Czech Republic today, and in Budapest by Kármán and Ullmann, an office who was really important in kind of transferring the aesthetics of the Wagner circle to Hungary. And you had a large format portfolio publication, kind of big unbound single pages that for architecture offices, you know, provided the images that they could immediately use to decorate facades. So Ladislaus Fiedler was one of the authors who kind of collected, who made this series of portfolios. And you see here from a facade in Budapest, which was again a work of Kármán and Ullmann. This is Otto Wagner. And you see here the building as a kind of contemporary photograph, an apartment building on Szabadság tér. Also for banks, for commercial offices and apartments. You see here the Post Office Savings Bank of Lechner that is still in the scaffoldings. Again, these kind of typical elements on the facades representing the Hermes, trade, commerce, as published in the portfolio series and as it is now in Budapest. Not far, just the next corner from the Lechner Post Office Savings Banks. Again, the same aesthetics you see here, you know, the metal as a kind of a framing of a pilaster, and the wreath that is kind of attached also with those rivets to the facade. Now Vágó, the Vágó brothers, who studied in Budapest, And still as students, they developed this competition project for the Lipótváros synagogue in Budapest. You can say, yes, this is very much, Lechner, this kind of window forms. Again, the wavy cornice. But on the other hand, and that is one point that I wanted to make, the beginnings of Otto Wagner also started somewhere there. This is one of the first works ever executed by Otto Wagner, probably recommended by Förster, who was the architect of the large synagogue in Budapest. And Wagner built in the Rumbach-Sebestyén Street this synagogue, which is very much kind of Oriental in his style, of course. That was since Gottfried Semper, who designed a synagogue for Dresden in the mid-19th century. It became the style, the so-called Moorish style for the synagogues, a very colorful facade, which is, it looks like stone, but in reality it is a very hard kind of plaster, stamped stone-like. And in the interior, this whole wealth of colors and ornament. One of the sources was Owen Jones, an English gentleman, an English artist who traveled, one of the first ones who made a trip to the east, and also to Andalusia in Spain, and made a very much appreciated and much used volume, even 2 volumes, on the ornaments of the Alhambra in Granada. This was a book that was rather widespread for Lechner and many other architects interested in Oriental design. It was used. Later, for Otto Wagner, you don't see anymore this kind of Orientalism, but you see the whole facade is clad with ceramics, with ceramic tiles coming from the Zsolnai factory. So it was a very important center for spreading kind of glazed ceramic material to the cities of the monarchy, even in the United States in some cases. And here you see a kind of a typical Central European building type, apartments and business. The business was very often 2 levels. It had already an elevator, a lift in the interior. And Otto Wagner wrote that it is our modern democratic time that thanks to this invention, the elevator, now the stories of the building have the same value. Traditionally, of course, it was the noble etage that has the most valuable, and then the servants kind of were accommodated under the cornice of the building. This time now it is all free, and this kind of freedom is represented by the fact that the window, it is like a carpet hanging from the main cornice, like a rug. The heaviest decoration in terms of tiles is under the cornice, which is a kind of an inversed tectonics. And then it becomes lighter and lighter. So in this kind of impression of hanging is there in the facade. And the Otto Wagner called this a cast facade, a cheese facade, because like in the Swiss cheese, these are just holes that are pierced into the facade without a kind of a tectonic framing. The drawing also kind of demonstrates this, and the building is also keeps a certain distance to its neighbor through these 2 kind of lateral elements. But the point that I wanted to make, that also for Otto Wagner, this issue, the ornamentalism, the ceramic cladding and so on, that we appreciated in the case of Lechner, was still very much present. Only in his case, step by step, he used this like as a kind of a tattooing, but the tattooing that can be kind of removed with a gesture, and then you have there the kind of facade that you see in the case of the post office savings bank. Vágó You know, he started with a very kind of Lechneresque ornamentalism. This is a kind of a relics museum that he designed with his brother. It was never executed, but he appreciated Lechner, and he wanted, you know, because there was again, the media, you know, the architectural, and not only the architecture, the popular press kept up this topic and said that, yes, Wagner hates our architecture, he's the enemy of the national style, and therefore he was, in the eyes of the contemporaries, a kind of an enemy of the Hungarian tendencies of the turn of the century. Vágó was in disagreement with this, and he very early wanted the two figures to meet. And he even arranged a meeting between Otto Wagner and Lechner, and he prepared this meeting by publishing a special issue of this Viennese art journal, Bildende Künstler, dedicated to Lechner. The whole issue is dedicated to Lechner with a number of essays, and the one written by Vágó was celebrating Lechner on one hand, but also making the point that Wagner's and Lechner's aesthetics are in contrast. And you have this, you know, on one hand you can see again this kind of pathos, the dynamics of the crescendo of the gable is something that is a motive in Lechner's architecture, but you can compare it quite well with Olbricht's Secession in Vienna, which is again an iconic building of the Viennese tendencies of the time. The Gutenberg House, which is again, you know, first of all, many cities in Western and Central Europe, after this kind of liberal age, the social issue became very important. Social democratic parties were blooming, and they erected as kind of centers, like the Gutenberg Otthon, the Gutenberg home in Budapest, which was not only, you know, a meeting place. It has a cafe, of course, a theater, a kind of a maison du peuple where even people, in this case even Lechner for a while, could live. Still in Zurich, you know, where I live, there is something like that, a Volkshaus is it called. So these were very important centers of the printers, you know, that the printers have also their location there, and the social democratic journals were very often, you know, edited and printed there. Lechner again with a water tower, but at this time Vágó was helping him in his office. Lechner was already quite fragile, let's say, old and also sick, so he needed help, and Vágó, who admired him, was indeed helping him also in terms of design. And probably the most important result of this cooperation between Lechner and Vágó is the Vermes apartment house in Budapest, in the Irányi Street. That in many respects you can also compare with the house where we are. An apartment building, again clad. In the case of Otto Wagner, it was the fixing rivets. In the case of the Vermes apartment house, it's decoration. You know, these are like ceramic elements that also see you in this house, you know, that were designed by Vágó and used as a kind of a rhythmic elements of the facade and the additional decoration. It is again just another comparison. You see here a particular detail from a church by Otto Wagner in Vienna, the Steinhofkirche, with the marble cladding, with the rivets and so on, very geometric, very machine-like. And in the case of Vágó, you see similarities, of course, the cladding and so on, the kind of point-like motifs, but again, elements that you would never find on a house by Otto Wagner. This article, Wagner and Lechner, that appeared in the very important architectural journal, a very finely designed journal of the time, Ahaz, the house. Wagner's work was published rather extensively there, and also his article, Wagner and Lechner in 1911. And I quote just a few sentences, which is a conclusion of this comparison. Under their hands, meaning the hands of Wagner and Lechner, the wonders of technology have raised the flower of art, filled the dead work of machines with spirit. Everything that technology, hygiene, social science, and aesthetics have invented so far, they have united and presented to mankind as a festive gift. This is you, man. You have acquired it. Everything belongs to you. You own the air, the light that penetrates your well-finished room. You own the gas, the electricity, the telephone. All the achievements of art are only there to make your life easy and pleasant. So I think these sentences that I quoted already foreshadow, what will come in 2 years. Vágó will become the representative of Hungary in the Werkbund, which was an association of industrialists, artists, craftsmen, architects, very important at that time, very much under, of course, Germanic influence, because it was Muthesius was one of the founders, other important German, but again, Austria, that was not quite compatible with the program, but the Wiener Werkstätte was part of it, and again, also there, when Vágó came to represent Hungary at a very important meeting of the German Werkbund that ended too abruptly because of the outbreak of the First World War. Again there, he emphasized the similarities and he emphasized the importance of Lechner's effort for modern architecture. You can think that maybe it's a little bit a kind of an overinterpretation of Lechner's work, but in any case, Wagner took over the presidency of the Werkbund, and he used this opportunity again to position Lechner on the international scene. I go just quickly, because it is not about the architecture of Vágó only, but some important buildings, the Arcade Bazaar toy store in Budapest. That very clearly is a kind of a fusion of Viennese and Hungarian elements. The summer hall of the Lipótváros Casino, indeed very Viennese. The Villa Schiffer that still exists. Again, on one hand, certainly the lessons of Muthesius, the English house, the hall with the stairwell and so on, the kind of a representative center of the house. But then the stone-clad facade, which reminds one on the villas that József Hoffmann built in Vienna last week in Budapest. And you can compare this kind of Gesamtkunstwerk that also this house, the Darvas house, is. And it has probably this most grandiose expression in Brussels, where József Hoffmann built for a banquier, the Palais Stockle, but one that, unlike the Darvas house here, you cannot visit. It is still in the possession of the family. But something that I wanted to emphasize here, that again, Hoffmann is working in a way that I would call atectonic, meaning non-tectonic. So you don't see here supporting elements, but the whole building is composed like a house of cards. On the big flat surfaces, the windows are kind of sliding from the main facade, and on the corners you have this framing, and even if two surfaces meet, then the framing is doubled. So it's like, flat elements that are positioned so that they don't carry anything. At least this is the impression that you get. I'm saying this because also Vágó was kind of picking up on this. You see his non-existing Villa Grünwald in Budapest, a brick facade on one hand, even with Italian reminiscences, but then again, you see the same kind of framing. It is interesting, and maybe you can criticize this, that on one hand, the using of elements like these are very much consistent with the thinking of an architect like Hoffmann or Wagner and so on. And very often with Vágó, you see that he uses these in a way that somehow results in a kind of a hybrid solution. Again, what I already described, and the detail, a kind of a magnification of an old photograph that is not very sharp, I'm sorry. And a few words about, his contemporary, the same age, Károly Benkó. This is the father of István Medgyaszay, Károly Benkó, who built a synagogue in Győr, compare it to Otto Wagner. And then the son, István Benkó, entered the school of Otto Wagner. And on one hand, he designed a building that is, of course, very much Wagner aesthetics. But he is also, he's a kind of a national pride. And then this kind of typical motive that in the Wagner school, all students used writing as a kind of a decoration. And in case of Medgyaszay, it is ide pislogas német, aki árgyélusa van a világnak, which is difficult to translate, but it is a kind of an ironic meme that look here, German, who is well, not quite evil, but kind of evil of the world. So he used this kind of very slight element of his drawing to represent his kind of Hungarian national identity. Otherwise, of course, it is a very Wagner school architecture. Of course, very radical, this kind of opening of the first floor. And then the peak of this. And it was a reason why some later historians of the Wagner school think that, the deep effect of Wagner's teaching is present in the way how an architect like István Benkó, who won the entrance into the Wagner school with a kind of a neo-Baroque gate project, then in a couple of years, in just 3 years, arrives at a very, very kind of radical facade, which is completely glazed. It's a department store where the light coming from the inside illuminates not only the facade, but the whole street. So this element, and it is very rare at this time. I don't know many, if any, architectural drawings from this time that shows the facade in kind of electric illumination in the night. And all, details from the interior. See, this oil is like fine wires, very, very thin, absolutely to the minimum reduced supporting elements. So this was the start, and then you would think, well, then István Medgyaszay, as he changed his name, became a kind of a representative of this kind of really kind of revolutionary modern aesthetics. But no. Surprisingly, Medgyaszay joined Dezső Malonyai in his ethnographic trips to the Transylvanian villages. So this volume, the first volume of Malonyai's A Magyar Nép Művészete, The Art of the Hungarian People, it is basically Kalotaszeg, and Medgyaszay was present. And for him, the lessons of Kalotaszeg was a lesson to make an architecture that has the logics of the vernacular thinking. He was not alone in this. Also even Hoffmann himself traveled to Capri, traveled to the Mediterranean, because he thought that this kind of traditional historicist architecture of villas is outdated, and you should learn this kind of picturesque mass compositions of vernacular building in Northern Africa and also in Capri. It is easy to develop a kind of a typology that is very variated, very free, very simple, flat roofs and so on. So this is a kind of a foreshadowing already the principles of modern architecture. That was the conviction of Hoffmann, and he published it as early as in 1897. Again, so no wonder that like many other students of Otto Wagner, some of them went to Bosnia, for instance, because again it has this kind of mystique of the Orient for them. But for Medgyaszay, the lessons of Körösf6 was a lesson in a kind of a logical construction according to the laws of wooden architecture. So these are his drawings of a secular gate and the tower of the Körösf6 church, constructed with this kind of typical here, as here, and Medgyaszay thought that now this is a form that is not purely ornamental. It is a form that comes from a lesson when you are, when you have a piece of wood and you bend it, before it breaks, they start, this kind of upper layers of wood start curling up. So again, this tells you something about how a certain material like a wood behaves. And it was his hypothesis that concrete architecture, which was very new at this time, concrete has a certain similarity to wood. Indeed, also early French architects like François Hennebique treated concrete like wood. And for Medgyaszay, again, the next step was to kind of transform the typical elements of this wooden architecture into concrete. So you see here his villas. You can compare it to Vágó's villas. The artist colony in Gödöllő has two such houses. One is for Sándor Nagy. Again, a very solid, rough brick facade with these iron beams. With the screws, again, a kind of a visible element of construction compared to Wagner, but also these supports that are treated in the manner of the Székely gates. I show this slide for comparing, the well-known national romanticism at that time Hungary, Károly Kósos Varjúvár, or the Toroczkai Vigans villa. Again, it is about proposition, the high roofs, the picturesque volumes, and so on. And this is, the position of István Medgyaszay. On one hand, the lessons of Körösf6, on the other hand, of course, the lessons of the Wagner soul. So much about divergences and convergences. I think it would be an interesting comparison that I didn't really make, but I'm just showing these two images, the Villa Grünwald that you already know, and the other artist's house in Gödöllő for Leo Belmonte. Well, you have also the pergola, again, concrete, of course, and with this kind of typical knots, or how you call them. So Otto Wagner invited Medgyaszay to present his results at this big conference, International Architectural Conference in Vienna, 1908, where he gave a lecture about the principles of new concrete architecture, illustrating it with his theater in Veszprém, Hungary, 1908. Again, this kind of fantastic light roof elements that are precast concrete shells that are hanging from an outside shell. It's congenial in its kind of lightness, and it is also used for ventilation. The light bulbs are just hanging in clusters from the ceiling. So on one hand, it is very simple, and on the other, again, the big hall of the city theater in Veszprém, and for comparison, the summer hall of the Lipótváros Casino that you already saw. And the further step, again, his Körösf6 drawing and a concrete church in Muja today in Slovakia, Rárosmujad at that time in Upper Hungary. Again, it is cast in concrete. You see it, kind of a drone picture from above. The dome was prefabricated as segments, and the segments were done kind of pressed together using this kind of visible belt. with the angel figures outside. The interior, again, I don't want to repeat what I have already seen about the lessons of Körösf6. And this is an architecture that I think Francis Onderdonk, an American architect, was present at his lecture in Vienna. So when Onderdonk made his handbook, that was a much used handbook in the United States, the ferro-concrete style reinforced concrete in modern architecture, published first in 1928 and later reprinted, then he was on one hand, kind of explaining the theories of Medgyaszay and illustrating it with his buildings in Hungary. So these are already the final images. For comparison, I'm going back, the detailing of the Steinhofskirche, the St. Leopold Church in Vienna on one hand, and the Városmújat Church in today's Slovakia. And this is probably the final image, kind of a surprise. So this development is not kind of leading us to the international modernism at all. So you see here two buildings, István Medgyaszay, the reformed women's high school, Bármadas in Budapest, and one of the winning projects, József Vágó's Palace of the League of Nations in Geneva, a competition project. And it was so much despised, when József Vágó applied for membership of the SIAM, the Association of Modern Architects, then Le Corbusier rejected it. He said that Vágó has no right to apply as an architect of modern architecture because he made such kind of archaic pseudo-monumental projects. And you can also make probably a similar argument in the case of Medgyaszay. He didn't continue this line that he started with the department store project in Vienna, but a heavy facade, concrete, stone-like stucco, painting, and so on. So I'm coming to the conclusion. The work of these two architects that were in the focus of my presentation shows both convergences and divergences. Vágó was influenced at the start of his career by Lechner's national style, and an individual style, but very much imitated, as I kind of mentioned, while Medgyaszay was student in the kind of cosmopolitan Otto Wagner school in Vienna, who rejected national style efforts. Then Vágó attempted a synthesis of Wagner's and Lechner's architecture, leaving Lechner's rich ornamentalism behind and using ornament more in the manner of the Wagner circle, first of all of Joseph Hoffmann, to accentuate surface borders, to decorate infills between structural elements. Medgyaszay hardly used ornaments before, this is different, but the lesson of Körösf6 meant for him learning from vernacular craftsmanship, applying typical detailing of timber construction on concrete, and in the 1920s, compared to the white or heroic modernism of Corbusier, Gropius, or Marchtarn, the building of Vágó and Medgyaszay appeared almost outdated, old-fashioned, even impure. But I would like to remind you to a lecture that I very much appreciate, a lecture held by Béla Bartók in 1942, the year is here important, that was called Race Purity in Music, and it was an argument against an effort for purity. And he emphasized the importance of what we could call, he didn't call it that way, a contamination. He said that when a folk melody passes the language frontier of a people, it will be subjected to changes, variations, enrichment. So for him, this kind of impurity, you know, this kind of richness in historical references, in materials and so on, was something that gives value and meaning to architecture. Indeed, we can understand the colors of Vágó's and Medgyaszay's architecture similarly as a true alternative to this white immateriality of the modern movement, an alternative that uses a wide palette of materials, colors, historical references, local allusions that carry meaning. And I think that this alternative is a very valid option even for the architecture of our time. That's it. Thank you very much.